It all started on a quiet, rainy evening. Emily and her husband, Mark, had just moved into a charming old house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't their dream home. It creaked in odd places, and the wallpaper seemed to peel on its own. But it was affordable and had a cozy charm they couldn't resist. The first night in the house, Emily awoke to the faint sound of crying. It was soft, almost muffled, like a baby somewhere far off. At first, she thought it was a dream, but when she nudged Mark awake, he didn't hear a thing. Convinced she was imagining things, Emily shrugged it off. But the crying returned the next night. This time, it was louder, clearer, as if it were coming from inside the house. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the attic. Emily hesitated, gripping Mark's arm to wake him. "Mark, wake up," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Mark groaned and rolled over, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "The crying," Emily said, her voice shaking. Mark paused, listening, and then his eyes widened. "You heard it too." They both got out of bed, their footsteps tentative as they climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The crying grew louder with every step. It was unmistakably a baby, soft, heart-wrenching cries that sent chills up their spines. When they reached the attic door, Emily hesitated. Her hand trembled as she gripped the doorknob. Mark nodded at her, signaling it was okay to open it. The attic was pitch black, the only light coming from their flashlight. The crying had stopped the moment they opened the door. The silence was deafening, broken only by their shaky breaths. They stepped inside, their flashlight beams darting around the room. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs filled the space, but there was no sign of a baby. "Maybe it's a stray cat or something," Mark suggested, his voice uneasy. Emily wasn't convinced, but she nodded anyway. They went back to bed, unsettled but exhausted. Over the next few nights, the crying became a nightly occurrence. It always started at the same time, exactly 2:15 a.m., and always came from the attic. Each time, Emily and Mark would investigate, but the attic was always empty. Emily began to notice other strange things too. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly, and she'd feel an odd pressure in her chest, as if she were being watched. She started seeing faint impressions on the dusty attic floor, like tiny footprints that weren't there the night before. One evening, Emily decided to do some research on the house. She spent hours at the local library, digging through old records. That's when she found it, a newspaper article from 1953. The headline read, "Infant found dead in attic of suburban home." Emily's stomach churned as she read the details. A young couple had lived in the house decades ago. Their newborn baby had mysteriously died in the attic, and the parents were too grief-stricken to stay in the house. They moved out shortly after, leaving behind whispers of a curse. When Emily told Mark what she'd found, he brushed it off. "It's just an old story," he said. "There's no such thing as ghosts." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next night, the crying didn't come from the attic. It came from their bedroom. Emily woke up to the sound right next to her ear, a soft, pitiful wail that sent ice through her veins. She shot up in bed, turning on the lamp. That's when she saw it. In the corner of their bedroom, where there had been nothing before, was a cradle. An old, wooden cradle, rocking gently on its own. Emily gasped, shaking Mark awake. "Mark, look!" Mark sat up, his eyes widening as he saw the cradle. He scrambled out of bed, his face pale. "What is that?" he stammered. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Her attention was fixed on the cradle. The crying was coming from inside it. Slowly, Emily approached, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She peered into the cradle, and her blood ran cold. It was empty. After that night, the house grew more hostile. Doors slammed shut on their own. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and the crying, it began following them. One evening, Emily was alone in the kitchen when she heard it again. The crying started faintly, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was right behind her. She spun around, clutching a knife, but there was no one there. "Leave us alone," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The crying stopped, but in its place, a soft, mocking laugh echoed through the house. The last night they spent in the house was the most terrifying. It began like the others, with the crying, but this time, It wasn't confined to the attic or the bedroom. It echoed through the entire house, louder and more desperate than ever before. Emily and Mark huddled together in the living room, clutching each other as the sound surrounded them. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to groan under an invisible weight. Suddenly, the crying stopped. The silence was so abrupt, so complete, it was almost worse than the noise. And then they heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like tiny feet padding across the floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a shadow began to form in the corner, a small, childlike figure. It stood motionless, its head tilted as if observing them. Emily and Mark couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure took a step forward, then another. "Why won't you help me?" a childlike voice whispered, filled with sorrow and malice. That was all it took. Emily and Mark bolted from the house, leaving everything behind. They never returned. Months later, the house was put back on the market. The real estate agent assured the new buyers that the rumors about the house were just stories. But late at night, when the wind is just right, the neighbors say they can still hear the faint sound of a baby crying. Mia was used to long drives. Her job as a traveling consultant often took her across the country, but this trip was different. The storm was relentless, the kind that made the windshield wipers feel useless. Sheets of rain blurred her vision as her GPS lost signal on a desolate stretch of road. She was desperate for a place to stop. The clock on her dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m., and the fatigue was clawing at her. When she spotted a flickering neon sign that read vacancy, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The hotel looked dated, a relic of the past. Its facade was gray with peeling paint, and the small parking lot held only a couple of cars. Still, it felt like a safe haven from the storm. She pulled in and parked her car near the entrance, rushing inside to escape the downpour. The lobby was dimly lit and eerily quiet. The air smelled of mildew, mixed with an odd metallic tang. Behind the counter stood an older woman with lifeless eyes and a forced smile. "Welcome. Need a room for the night?" the woman asked in a monotone voice. "Yes, please," Mia said, brushing water droplets from her jacket. The woman slid a rusted key across the counter. "Room 306. Upstairs, at the end of the hall." Mia thanked her and headed up the creaky staircase. She noticed how narrow the hallways were, lined with faded floral wallpaper that seemed stained with age. The light fixtures buzzed softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. She reached room 306, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was plain but serviceable. A bed with a worn-out comforter, a small desk, an outdated box TV, and a single window with heavy curtains. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. She locked the door behind her and set her suitcase down by the bed. As Mia lay down, the exhaustion hit her like a wave. She turned off the bedside lamp, leaving the room in complete darkness except for the faint glow of the hallway light seeping through the edges of the door. She was just about to drift off when she heard it, the sound of faint footsteps. At first, she thought it was someone in the hallway, but then the sound stopped, right outside her door. She held her breath, listening intently. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then came the soft creak of a floorboard inside her room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for the lamp. When the light finally flickered on, the room was empty. The door was still locked, and there was no sign of anyone. Mia tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, heightened by exhaustion. She turned the lamp back off and forced herself to close her eyes. It wasn't long before she woke again, this time to an overpowering metallic smell, like rusted iron. It filled the air, making her gag. She turned on the lamp again, but the light flickered weakly, casting an unsettling glow on the room. She sat up, scanning her surroundings. The wallpaper looked different, warped and discolored, almost as if it were melting. Her pulse quickened when she noticed something else. The pattern on the wallpaper appeared to shift, almost like veins pulsing beneath the surface. And then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like nails dragging lightly across wood, but it grew louder and more frantic, coming from the closet across the room. Mia froze, her eyes glued to the closet door. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was someone hiding in there? Had they been in her room the whole time? Summoning what little courage she had, she grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and approached the closet. The scratching continued, relentless and desperate. Her hand trembled as she gripped the handle. She yanked the door open, holding the lamp high. The closet was empty. The scratching stopped instantly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Mia slammed the door shut and backed away, her chest heaving. She didn't sleep the rest of the night, instead sitting upright on the bed with the lamp on, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, Mia was desperate to leave. She hurriedly packed her belongings, double-checking that she hadn't left anything behind. The room felt wrong, like it was watching her, urging her to leave as fast as possible. She made her way down to the lobby, expecting to see the woman at the front desk. But when she stepped into the space, she stopped dead in her tracks. The lobby looked abandoned. The once dim lighting was gone entirely, leaving the room in shadows. Dust coated every surface, and the chandelier hung broken, its shards scattered across the floor. Mia called out, her voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no response. Confused and unnerved, she turned to look back at the staircase. But the staircase was gone. Her heart raced as she scanned the area. Where the staircase and hallway leading to her room had been was now just a solid wall. Room 306, the room she had spent the night in, no longer existed. Panicking, Mia ran outside into the parking lot. The rain had stopped, but her car was gone. The lot was completely empty, save for overgrown weeds poking through cracks in the asphalt. She flagged down a passing car on the main road and climbed in, explaining her situation to the driver, an older man with a weathered face. "I stayed at the hotel back there," she said, her voice trembling. "But something's wrong. My car's missing, and the hotel looks abandoned." The man gave her a puzzled look. "Hotel? There hasn't been a hotel on that road for years." Mia's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I stayed there last night. Room 306. The man shook his head. "That place burned down decades ago. A fire took out the entire building, killed several guests and staff. It's just a ruin now." Desperate for answers, Mia begged him to take her back to the site. When they arrived, her blood turned to ice. The hotel was nothing more than a charred foundation, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by crumbling rubble. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed something glinting in the ashes. Her heart sank as she realized what it was. Her suitcase, scorched and barely intact. Mia tried to put the experience behind her, but the memories lingered. At night, she'd wake to the faint scent of rusted iron. Worse, she began hearing the same scratching noise, now coming from her closet at home. One evening, as she was unpacking her bag, she froze. At the bottom of her suitcase was a key, a rusted key with the number 306 etched into it. She never told anyone what happened that night, but deep down, she knew the truth. Room 306 wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting for its next guest. Rain slicked the streets of the unfamiliar city, and the air hung heavy with the damp chill of midnight. Olivia had spent the evening with friends, celebrating a reunion that stretched longer than she'd anticipated. As the clock struck 12:45 a.m., she decided it was time to head back to her hotel. The city wasn't known for its reliable public transport at this hour, so she opted for the next best thing, a taxi. As she waited beneath a flickering streetlight, a taxi rolled up. Its black paint gleamed under the drizzle, and the driver gave her a curt nod. Something about the cab was peculiar. The interior lights were dim, and the license plate was partially obscured by dirt. Still, it wasn't a time to be choosy. She climbed in, shutting the door behind her. "Hotel Riviera, please," Olivia said, leaning back against the worn leather seat. The driver didn't respond, but the car began moving. Olivia noticed his reflection in the rearview mirror, an older man with a gaunt face, deep-set eyes, and an unnervingly blank expression. He wore a dark jacket, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "You know the way, right?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. He gave a slight nod but said nothing. The car's interior smelled faintly of damp earth, and the sound of the windshield wipers was the only thing punctuating the silence. Olivia tried to shake off her unease by scrolling through her phone, but the screen showed no service. As the car wound through the streets, Olivia began to notice something strange. The city lights grew dimmer, and the streets seemed less familiar. The tall buildings gave way to empty lots and darkened alleyways. Excuse me, she said, leaning forward slightly. This doesn't look like the way to my hotel. The driver didn't respond. Her unease deepened as the taxi took a sharp turn down a narrow, unlit street. The buildings on either side were dilapidated, their windows shattered, and graffiti covered the walls. The rain had turned the road into a muddy path. Hey, where are you taking me? Olivia's voice was sharper now, laced with fear. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. Shortcut, quicker this way. Despite his explanation, Olivia felt no relief. The way he said it sent chills down her spine. The car slowed as it approached an old, rusted bridge. The headlights illuminated the structure, revealing corroded beams and a mist rolling off the water below. Olivia's instincts screamed at her to get out, but the car continued across the bridge. When she glanced out the window, her breath caught in her throat. Figures stood in the fog, shadowy, motionless silhouettes lining the bridge. They didn't move or react as the taxi passed by, their heads slightly tilted as if watching her. She turned to the driver, panic rising in her voice. Who are they? What is this place? He didn't answer. The silence inside the car was suddenly broken by static from the radio. The crackling grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers. Olivia strained to make out the words. Don't look back. Her chest tightened as she realized the message wasn't coming from the driver, but the radio itself. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. At first, she saw nothing but the back seat. Then she froze. A figure sat there, a pale woman with hollow eyes and dark hair matted to her face. Olivia whipped her head around, but the back seat was empty. Stop the car, she screamed, her voice trembling. The driver didn't respond. The taxi sped up, the engine growling as it tore through the misty darkness. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the encroaching fog. Olivia gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed. Let me out, she yelled, banging on the window. The driver finally spoke again, his voice colder than before. Too late for that. The radio static grew louder, and the whispers became screams. Olivia clamped her hands over her ears, but the noise was deafening. The air inside the taxi felt oppressive, heavy with an unexplainable dread. And then the car came to an abrupt stop. Outside, the fog had cleared slightly, revealing a clearing surrounded by gnarled, leafless trees. The headlights illuminated an old, decrepit house with shattered windows and a sagging roof. What is this place? Olivia stammered, tears streaming down her face. The driver turned around for the first time. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pierce through her. Your stop. Olivia didn't wait. She clawed at the door, kicking it open with all her strength. She stumbled out into the mud, falling to her knees as the cold air bit at her skin. Behind her, the taxi remained motionless, its headlights casting an eerie glow on the house. When she turned to look at the driver, the car was empty. But then she heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the mud, coming closer. She didn't wait to see who or what it was. She bolted toward the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches tore at her clothes and skin as she ran, but she didn't dare stop. The whispers from the radio echoed in her mind. Don't look back. Finally, she burst onto a main road, collapsing onto the pavement. A car screeched to a halt in front of her, and the driver, a middle-aged man, jumped out to help. Are you okay? What happened? He asked, helping her to her feet. Olivia tried to explain, but her words came out in fragments. She turned to point toward the direction she had come from, but the forest was empty. There was no clearing, no house, and no taxi. She made it back to her hotel that night, shaken but alive. Olivia tried to convince herself it was a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But the next morning, as she reached for her purse, she froze. Inside was a small object, a weathered taxi receipt with faded writing. The date? From 5 years ago. And scrawled at the bottom were the words, "Thank you for riding."